The Dynasties of England. Sounds straightforward, isn't it? England has been a nation that has grown famous for the right and wrong reasons throughout time. A small island that even today seems to play a big role in the world of nations. It is also one of the few countries that still has a monarchy, and in some ways is one of the most famous that still has its monarchy. In England, and subsequently the United Kingdom, the monarch is the head of state, both a ceremonial title that allows long-honoured traditions to continue, but also a practical one that helps keep the balance of power within the nation. Throughout its time, since the first monarch of England, there has been many different dynasties rule over the throne. But here is where things get a little bit complicated, so I think the best way to start off would be for me to explain dynasties. So a dynasty is a set of individuals who all come from the same family tree, which can lead you quite quickly to scratch your head. So say for example, I say everyone descends from William the Conqueror, if we still stick within English monarchies. But then even our monarch today descends from William the Conqueror, but they're classified into a different dynasty. So here's where you need to explain it a bit more. So dynasties are decided, or English ones very simply, since we're going to remain in England and not talk about the rest of the world. The English dynasties are based on the bloodline of the male, which I know in this modern world some people scratch their heads with, but here's where you go into detail. Say for example, you have William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror is the head of his dynasty. That dynasty can continue going down. However, when the throne passes to a female who has subsequently married into a different house, and by the old laws of marriage now belongs to that house instead of the house of her birth, that is when the dynasties change. Additionally, dynasties also change when there's conquest. Say for example, the Anglo-Saxons ruled and then the Normans came and conquered England. The dynasty then changes due to conquest and not via blood. We'll go into more detail as we go down into each one, because unfortunately also with modern day world, that also isn't completely the case as well. And the last dynasties we get to is where things get very complicated. So I will address that further along in the video when we get to that point. So let us begin. Whilst many famously know of the dynasties such as the Tudors or the Georgian period, in this video we will go through each dynasty from the beginning. So to go right back to the beginning, we have to go to the unification of England. England wasn't always united, which is kind of entertaining when you think how England is also quite often referred to as the United Kingdom due to the uniting of multiple nations. Well, England in its creation itself was a unity of nations. There were many smaller nations that made up the area that then became England. These were nations such as Wessex, East Angles, Kent, Mercia, and I can continue. Some we still know by name, such as, for example, East Angles is now known as East Anglia, which is a region comprised of Suffolk, Essex, Norfolk and Cambridge. Or Kent is also a county. However, others such as Mercia have been lost to time and are just old names. These dynasties within these smaller chiefdoms and countries usually comprised of between the Celts and the Saxons. Predominantly. Some were left over from the Romans, but predominantly they were these two. The unification of England then subsequently led to the first ruler of England, and its name, happened during the reigns of the Anglo-Saxons, so when the Anglo-Saxons dominated England. It is stated that Athelstan, which is a rather famous name in the Anglo-Saxons, was the first king of all England. Hence the reason why Athelstan became such an important name. Though the Anglo-Saxons are an interesting dynasty to look at, because they did not work as linearly as the monarchs you have later on down the line. So, for a little bit more context, you had a royal family. Athelstan, Ecgbert, Alfred the Great, Edward the Confessor, I could continue. But the crown didn't necessarily fall from father to son. In Anglo-Saxon times, the monarch was decided by the Witan. The Witan was a part of a nobility, and they met in what was known as a Witangonnament for the choosing of a monarch, when the previous one had passed away. So as a result, you could go from a king having passed away and his son not taking the throne, but instead the king's brother, or the third son of the set. It wasn't necessarily straightforward. And in addition, sometimes the new monarch was chosen by the Witan who was outside of the royal family, which is where we get to the second dynasty. So the Anglo-Saxons ruled quite solidly between 1927 to 1066, excluding one set of period of time. This period of time was when the Danes, also more commonly known as the Vikings, came about. Now, the Vikings, or the Danish, had been raiding England for many years and centuries and decades before this came about. But you then had a king of Denmark by the name of Sven Forkbeard, who decided he wanted to take the throne of England. Sven Forkbeard succeeded, and he conquered England, taking the throne from the aptly named King Ethelred the Unready in 1013. But Sven Forkbeard only kept the throne for a short time before he himself passed away. Afterwards, Ethelred received the throne once more, and it went back to the Anglo-Saxons. And in some ways you could think that was just a blip and that was the end of it, because after Ethelred came his son Edmund Ironside. But Edmund Ironside had the throne in challenge with Sven Forkbeard's son. So this occurred when the Witan had essentially two Witangonnaments, where one set of the nobles decided that Edmund Ironside would be their monarch, and another set of nobles had a different Witangonnament and decided that Sven Forkbeard's son, Canute, who would be famously known as Canute the Great, was instead the monarch, which led to a lot of fighting and England being divided once more between these two kings. However, it was stipulated that should Canute die, then his area of England would revert to Edmund and vice versa. But Edmund Ironside passed away before Canute, which is a rather famous death, which we will go over in a different video, because I know what you're thinking, and most people would think, Canute executed the king to take the whole of England, but it's not as straightforward in the case as one may think. After Canute came the natural of his son, but his son is an interesting one, because his son is both half Dane, but also half Saxon, and is the reason why the Danish rule at the end of this son of Canute goes back to the Anglo-Saxons. You see, Canute married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy. So technically speaking, Canute the Great was married to Edmund Ironside's stepmother. since Edmund Ironside was Athelred's son via a first marriage and not the second of Emma of Normandy. When Canute and Emma of Normandy had a son, Hardicanute, he was the half-brother of an Anglo-Saxon prince. This Anglo-Saxon prince being the child of Ethelred and Emma of Normandy. So this Anglo-Saxon prince had both one half-brother that was the child of the Danes, and one half-brother who was the last ruler of the Anglo-Saxons at this time. And this half-brother was known as Edward. When Hardicanute passed away without any children, he named his half-brother Edward his heir. So as a result, this caused the throne to revert back to the Anglo-Saxons, and this Edward became the infamous Edward the Confessor. And as a result, until 1066, there was stability. Anglo-Saxons ruled, and everything was normal. And then we get to the next dynasty. So, we've had Anglo-Saxons rule since the unification of England, with a minor blip in between with the Danes. But it was a solid rule. Unfortunately, the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons, and subsequently this next dynasty, don't technically speaking have any surnames, like our more famous ones down the line. So as a result, they're only really called by their classification. However, and most famously, the next dynasty comes to the throne with the infamous Battle of 1066, when the Saxons fall and the Normans rise. Normandy was a country that lived close to England. What was Normandy in the past is now part of modern-day France. But in 1066, the Normans had invaded England, and they successfully won. So as a result, they gained the throne of England via conquest, which leads to the most famously named king of all England, William the Conqueror. He is a name that most English children would know of. You learn about him in school, or at the very least you learn about his name. His name is infamous, even if there is a lot of people who don't really know much about him. So he will be a fascinating individual that we will go over at a different time. William the Conqueror, though, is an interesting individual to point out, due to the fact that every monarch since that has had a claim to the English throne stems through the bloodlines all the way up to William the Conqueror. Yes, the bloodlines may be watered down in a few areas and you have to go through some twists and turns, but theoretically they all come from the same king. Interesting enough, there is speculation of whether or not William the Conqueror inspired George R.R. Martin's Aegon the Conqueror, because within the Song of Ice and Fire you have the same ruling, where they all stem from this one specific individual. William had a couple of sons. However, he chose to divide his territories amongst his sons, which didn't always go the best. The beginning of this dynasty is quite famous, partially due to the simple reason of, since the death of William the Conqueror, you had multiple brothers that fought over the thrones, one succeeding more than the other, and then subsequently the dynasty changed from being known as Normans to actually gaining a surname by the time of the grandchildren. So here's a bit to explain. The Normans, or what we classify the Normans, it consists of three individual kings. You had William the Conqueror, his son William Rufus, who subsequently had no children and possibly was murdered. And then you have the younger brother, who quickly took the throne after the unfortunate death of his older sibling, Henry I. Now there are a few other sons of William the Conqueror, but none of them became king. And by the time that Henry I had an issue with his heirs, the brothers weren't an issue anymore. Henry I had 2 children, a daughter called Matilda and a son. And you would think everything's fine. You have a son and an heir and you can continue the Norman bloodline as normal. Until you have an incident. A famous shipwrecking known as the White Ship, which we will cover at a different point. But subsequently, this accident leads to the death of quite a few royals, including Henry I's son and heir. So what does he do? Well, he names his daughter as his heir, which would naturally lead to a dynasty change. However, as history would tell us, it doesn't go as straightforward as that. Many barons and lords didn't like the idea of a woman ruling them. So as a result, when Henry I died, and his daughter Matilda was still in the areas of Normandy, or France, the barons and lords chose a different monarch. They instead chose an individual called Stephen of Blois, who in some ways is a dynasty just solidly of his own. Stephen of Blois or Blois is descended from William the Conqueror via a daughter instead of a son. This daughter's name is Adela, and she is the sister of William Rufus or William II and Henry I. But specifically, he was a male, instead of Matilda, who was female. This dynasty was one and done, if you will. The House of Blois, or Blois, ended with just Stephen. This is due to the fact that Matilda contested for the throne, which led to a civil war that is known famously as the Anarchy, and is an interesting subject that we will go over at a different time. Matilda did take control of England for a time, although she was never officially crowned, and the Anarchy ended with a contract or a treaty, if you will. This treaty stipulated that the throne would go to Matilda's own child, her son, at the end of Stephen's death. So as a result, Stephen was a solo king of a dynasty. Due to the fact that Matilda was a woman, and so subsequently married, and as stipulated before the rules of her becoming part of a different house, you do not stay with the Normans, and when her son Henry takes the throne as Henry II, it is classified as a dynastic change, even though we are still just talking of the great-grandson of William the Conqueror. It's how the structure works. This next dynasty, that subsequently begins with Henry II, is a rather remarkable family, and is a name that crops up many a time. It is the first one with a set of surnames, because Empress Matilda married a gentleman called Geoffrey Plantagenet, and so the next dynasty name, although a direct branch from the Normans, is known as the Plantagenets. The Plantagenets ruled England for well over 300 years, and they didn't lose the throne until they kinda near enough destroyed themselves. As was stated very much before, the thrones of England, and I suppose in some ways some other countries, quite often change either via conquest or them running out. Male heirs can quite often run out if they decide to fight one another, and the Plantagenets are most infamous for it. But they are some of the most famous. Powerful rulers who changed great pieces of England include individuals like Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, Edward Longshanks. These monarchs are famous in their own right. But the Plantagenet dynasty did end up having issues, which is where we come to our 2 honourable mentions. They are not a different dynasty. They are still the Plantagenet dynasty, but they are famously known differently. This, of course, is the dynastic power struggle, famously known as the War of the Roses, and is more famous now than ever due to George R.R. Martin stating how the War of the Roses inspired his own fantasy books of A Song of Ice and Fire. These two dividing sides of the Plantagenets are more famously known as the Houses of York and Lancaster, and they came about after the Lancastrian king, King Henry IV, began his rule by usurping his cousin, Richard. Richard II, this cousin, was the direct line, or the direct male line, going down from Henry II. So theoretically this was the royal line, until the Lancastrians took it. Now the Lancastrians are still Plantagenets, they are still a part of the same dynasty, but they're just different branches, if you will. This Lancastrian side would continue to hold the throne of England until King Henry VI, which during the reign, you then subsequently had the House of York dispute their claim to the throne. The York divide did manage to take the throne from King Henry VI and crowned their own King Edward IV, and the throne jumped back and forth between the two for a little while, with many a bloody conflict and war and battle going on between them, hence the reason for the War of the Roses. So as a result, the Plantagenet dynasty did not technically end, even if it jumped back and forth between the houses of York and Lancaster, until its last monarch, Richard III, was killed in the Battle of Bosworth Fields. So this is where we mark the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, even if there was many hands changing between different branches of this dynasty. And technically speaking, the next dynasty does still stem from Plantagenet, but is a different dynasty for a couple of reasons. So, we're now on to the next dynasty, and this dynasty is the most famous of them all. This dynasty is known as the Tudors. Due to the length of this video, we shall continue in part 2. If you wish, leave a comment down below, and I will also create a video of both part 1 and part 2 together. Though I will admit, that video will be nearly an hour long.